Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell a friend and give it a mention on your favorite social media platforms. Also, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It might just inspire Apple to promote us a little. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. I've got a business trip to LA this week, so our new episode comes at you a little bit early this time. Unlike my past LA visits, I have no podcast lined up for this one, which is killing me because I actually just turned down one with a guest I've been chasing for a long time. The problem is I'm going there on business, and between the family medical situation I talked about a few weeks ago, the whomping of a snowstorm we're supposed to get tonight in New Jersey, and a ton of work I have to do this week, I'm going to have almost no time for extracurricular activity while I'm out there. I'm going to land 7:30 at night with an hour-long car ride to the hotel, presumably crashing shortly thereafter. In the hotel, not in the car. Then I'm up the next morning, few hours to kill, lunchtime meeting, facility tour with a client, over to the biotech panel that I'm moderating, which is the reason I'm out there, reception after the panel, and then I'm back to the airport for an 11 o'clock flight back to New Jersey. That's 11 p.m. I've been sort of half-heartedly making plans to record with people on that Monday that I was going to get in, but never really locked anything down because my timetable was really fluid and I just felt off. I just felt like something was going to come up. And with the snow coming down right now, it's just as well I didn't schedule anything, even though I am loath to make an LA trip without getting in some podcasts. And as you may have figured out from that earlier comment about the flight back, I will be landing in Newark at 7 a.m. on Wednesday, which promises for an entertainingly out-of-it day of work. All this is just a reminder that while my life and occasional social media posts may make things look somewhat nonchalant or even somehow enviable, this life is actually a nonstop race to spackle over giant holes and just make it look like the whole structure is still standing up. So that's what I got going on. And that brings us to this week's guest, or more accurately, this week's guest's new book. James Sturm is our guest this time around, and he's here primarily to talk about Offseason, his amazing new graphic novel from Drawn and Quarterly. Offseason is, well, it's beautifully drawn. It is an episodic story about a disintegrating marriage, and it's set around the time of the 2016 election and its aftermath. It's narrated by the husband, a contractor who is trying to keep his shit together and not be too terrible a dad to his young kids, afford a new place, pay child support, etc. It's set in Vermont, and the oppressiveness of winter is its own character in this book, and it's reflected in the blue washes that James uses throughout. The other weird thing, James also uses anthropomorphics throughout the book. That is the characters all have animal heads. We get into the why of that in our conversation. It's for non-comics people, it's a standard trope in comics. It's something James actually used early in his career. It's just something you're going to notice. But suffice to say, James handles the story so well that the technique doesn't create a distraction at all. And the characters are still really expressive. They have dog heads. He also, when it comes to storytelling, does a wonderful job of integrating the psychological effects of the election and its impact, sort of mirroring our fractured electorate with this broken family. I mean, it's not as simplistic as wife equals Hillary, husband equals Trump, but it reflects the weird times we're living in and how the outer world is just infecting every aspect of our personal lives. So Offseason, really, really fantastic book. Now, my parents' divorce was much different than the circumstances James portrays for this character and family, but the divorce aspect of the story still resonated pretty heavily with me on a personal level, which means I can't say I enjoyed Offseason, but I can say it's a very strong piece of art, and I hope you give it a read. Now, James and I have talked about getting together for quite a while, and luckily the book came up and brought him to New York so we could get together because James lives up in Vermont, and that's where he's the director of the Center for Cartoon Studies, an institution that he founded. A recent guest, Jason Lutz, is an instructor there, and I think we talked about that in our episode. So we were sort of waiting on when I would get up to Vermont, which I'm still hoping to do because there are a bunch of other guests up there I'd love to sit down with. But the thing is, when James and I met a few years ago, we started shooting the breeze at a comics festival, and we learned that we grew up about 20 to 25 minutes away from each other, and that we were shopping at the same flea market and comic shops on Route 59 in Nanuet, New York, probably buying some of the same comics. He's a little bit older than me, so he drifted away from superheroes earlier than I did. But the common geography also plays into our conversation, as well as the bonus segment that comes at the end and is incredibly messed up. You'll need to stick around after we finish the main conversation. Trust me, it's worth it. As caveats go, we recorded in a pal's apartment in New York City. Okay, it was Jesse Scheidlauer's place. And that means there's some truck and traffic noise outside. Nothing too bad. Also an echo, which I really need to figure out how to correct for because I love recording at Jesse's place, but I always get this sort of echo from the conversation, from the way the acoustics work in the dining room. Anyway, here is James' bio. It's from the flap copy of Offseason. There's a more extensive version of his bio at the Drawn and Quarterly website. James Sturm is an award-winning cartoonist whose books have been translated widely. His work has appeared on Slate, the New York Times, and on the cover of The New Yorker. He is also the co-founder of the Seattle newspaper The Stranger and the Center for Cartoon Studies, a cartooning college. James lives in Heartland, Vermont with his family and 2 dogs. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with James Sturm. So speaking of unpaying jobs,
sure.
Tell me about the origin of Offseason. Where did it begin for you, and how did it reach the form it's in now?
The origin of Offseason was 5 index cards.
What are you, Nabokov? Sorry, that's my obscure literary reference kick off, but
that's the first time, that I've been mentioned in his company. 4 or 5 index cards, and it was just a little sketch of a divorced dog on the beach, kind of ruminating about where he was at, and I even wrote the words off, sea, sun, 3 words, and I didn't know where. I didn't really have anything to do with it. I put it aside, and then 5-6 years later. Let's see, my daughter, 3 years ago now, I was going to an artist colony, and I was bringing this big, long book I was working on. And I know, when you have a month just to work on a single project, it's going to drive you batty. So I just grabbed my little idea pile and bits and pieces from my studio, and I grabbed those index cards. And that became the project. It kind of took over my creative life. And it started that character, and I started exploring more and more, and then suddenly I was doing that work to avoid the work that I brought there. And also, just like the title of the book implies, I was just starting to come out of my own personal off-season. And I think this book was a way to help me through that process.
And you referenced that in the acknowledgments to the book at the end, sort of the rough times you were going through. Is that anything you can go into, or is it something we should just try and extrapolate from based on the book itself?
I really like the way you asked that question, because I'm at the very start of this, my little book tour of the book's about to come out. I'm about to start promoting it, and I really haven't quite decided how far deep or whatnot. I do want to go. Maybe we should start with the book.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And go from there.
I don't, generally think it's advisable. I think it's inadvisable to put too much of the author's life in, except when I did the Carol Tyler episode, which turned into a massive therapy session, which you don't seem to really need at this point because you've got the book. And,
that's what the book's for.
Yeah. Well, tell me about setting it, though, when you did. You'd started it years ago, but it's set in and around the 2016 election.
Right. That wasn't originally the intention. Mm-hmm. The intention was to really talk about this relationship that's at the heart of the book, and this couple that are desperately trying to find their way back to one another despite all odds. And when I decided to set it, I knew it was going to be contemporary, and until the Republican primary in Trump's nomination, I don't know, it felt like the contemporary felt like it could be more vague somehow. Yeah. And suddenly you realize, boy, if I'm going to set something contemporary, I can't avoid this. This has to be part of it. And then the more that I started kind of bringing that into the book, I realized there were a lot of characters, like the contractor, for instance, that started resonating with current events, and it just seemed to make sense. It just seemed to make sense on some deep, fundamental way for the DNA of the book. My editor at the time at Slate, I started serializing some of these, and Dan Quast was also pushing me to, kind of make it a little more topical.
And the decision to make it contemporary, given that we'll say your grown-up comics, as opposed to the two books you did, are primarily historical fiction.
Yeah.
Of a sort. Where did that desire to do something
I did years ago. I did this series for Fantagraphics when I first started called The Serial Killings, and that was animals in contemporary.
And that comes into the next question.
Oh, okay. But it's there is, it isn't an outlier for sure. I think also with this book, when Trump was elected, I think so many of us just what the fuck just happened? Mm-hmm. We weren't paying attention. How could this happen? And it was a bit of a shock, obviously. And there was this kind of doubling down on paying attention. So the idea of setting a book where I could walk out of my house on a snowy road and start drawing, where I could go to the supermarket, where I could really bring in things that were right in front of me, just seemed a sane response or grasping at something,
there is no sane response, but go on.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't know. I think, I don't consider myself a political cartoonist, but nobody can afford not to be political now. It might not be in people's comfort zone for a while to, one can kind of peel off into one's privilege and not pay attention. But now
but it's implicit.
Trump is forcing us to all pay attention.
Yeah, it's implicit in whatever you do, whether you choose to ignore it or not. So
there was a real visceral need to just pay attention to what was happening at this moment in time, and that definitely fed the book, the election season.
Mm-hmm. Using anthropomorphics?
Well, I kind of addressed that in the book in a little sly way when the couple meet at a theater performance. Staging of Animal Farm, a feminist version of Animal Farm. and they're wearing masks, and there's a Q&A, and somebody asks about the mask. And yes, wearing a mask is liberating. It's liberating when one wears one. It's liberating when you put your characters in one or making them into animals. There's also just something about the path of least resistance in a work. Like when I was first fumbling around with this, I couldn't even wrap my brain around like whole comic pages. Like I could just do almost like one index at a time, one vignette at a time. And so I'll put dog heads on them for now, so I don't have to worry about what they all look like and what race they should be and what color. It was just too many decisions, like how to design all these characters. And I thought if I just throw the dog heads on, that'll be fine. And then it was like the placeholder became like, oh yeah, this looks so strange and off, and that's just one element of the offness. There was one review I just read that like, you kind of forget they're animals once you start reading it a little while. And I felt I'm glad that was the case, at least with that reader, where like there's something like how abnormal everything becomes and how quickly it becomes normal.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. It's not like the using anthropomorphics did not turn into, these are just a couple of dogs talking.
Yeah.
It did feel like people ultimately.
Yeah, but I don't have any like grand, why, I really don't. It was a very much an organic process of that happening. And I've done little one-off comics or in my sketchbooks where I just make myself into a dog. And it's funny, I've always Snoopy was my first love as a cartoonist.
Yeah.
And I've always thought, cartooning, like my superpower as a cartoonist is doggedness as much as anything. I've been at it for so long, and eventually you learn something doing it. So I that kind of doggedness is I don't know, somehow worked its way into it as well.
What have you learned? It's been a couple of decades. You're a little bit older than me, which means you should be much more accomplished than I am. So.
What have I learned as a cartoonist? I don't know. So many things. I know I've learned that there's no right way to do things. Mm-hmm. There's only my way to do things, and my way to do things is always going to be changing from project to project. I've learned that the available resources or the appropriate resources, whatever I have of talent, of time, I've just got to bring that to the table. I've learned to enjoy it a lot more. In the last year, I've just been feeling very fortunate and just happy just to be in my studio practicing my craft. And that's been enough, and that's just, not just my own writing and drawing my own comics, but editing other people's work and just spending time with a piece and thinking about it and looking and figuring out ways to help that piece express itself more fully, and not worrying about some of the other stuff that young cartoonists might worry about.
Yeah, remember an old interview, probably in the Journal or somewhere with you, where it was working on a graphic novel means 100% immersion, and there's no time for anything else, and I'd be giving it short shrift.
Yeah. I feel
that's really gone by the wayside.
Oh, absolutely. I think as a younger cartoonist, I'd roll the boulder up the hill, and it was the only the only boulder I was pushing, and then when the boulder stopped rolling, I would just beat my head against it to try to keep it moving. I'd maybe more energy to push that boulder. And I think probably my organizing metaphor now, I feel like I'm almost like a tracker in the woods where I'm following something, and I'll stay on the trail of it for as long as I can. And then when I lose it, I just don't wander around the woods aimlessly. I'll just kind of wait silently at my drawing table until something else crosses my trail. So as a result, I might have 2 projects going, or 3, and I'll wait till I'll wait for one of them to show itself and kind of jump on that. And then of course, as you get towards the end of a project, it does require like that immersion, but and there are ebbs and flows too. I mean, as you get older, you have other obligations and you have relationships and children.
I was going to ask, were kids the step that compelled the time management to really, to get things down, or you were already headed in that direction before kids?
I've always been kind of a studio rat. Before I had kids, roll out of bed, go to my drawing board, stay up late, don't go out on weekends. Even before I had kids. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure for sure, young kids does force one to organize. But I've always, I mean, I definitely, like when I was younger, I just had more time, to be at the drawing board. Now, like I try every Sunday to just kind of, my sketchbook, just like draw my calendar out and kind of reserve the chunks of time that I need to draw, a big chunk of time where all I'm doing is just in my studio.
Yeah, tell me about the shape of the book in terms of the physical form of it. Every page is 2 identical panels.
Yeah.
And it's a choice, and it's one that mitigates against certain types of comics vernacular, the use of varying panel sizes and shapes to do things. None of that exists in this book, really.
Yeah.
What led to that? Was it a self-induced challenge or
no, not at all. As I said, I've been working using index cards as my panels, and the book is a series of these vignettes that are chapters. Mm-hmm. Each one I tried to kind of have it stand alone in its own way, but I think there's a narrative arc through the whole thing, or I hope there is.
Oh wait, those are all the same guy? I'm just kidding. I only say this because I once received a comic in proofs that the pages were sent 2-sided, loose pages, and I literally read the book backwards, not realizing that it was starting from the other side because there's no page numbers on anything. And finally, oh, wait a second, that's a title page. Right. My bad.
It's like that episode of Seinfeld where they do it backwards.
Yeah, well, in this case, it was an Alan Moore book, and that made it slightly plausible, but still
that's funny.
Not so good. No, I'm kidding though. But in terms of working off the index cards, that was
I was talking about the path of least resistance. It's like I just would write an index. I just kind of like lay out a little chapter on these index cards and tack them to the wall and develop them, move them around, keep rewriting things, and then I would put them in those. Get one of those little 4x6 photo albums you can buy at the 99-cent store. So each little chapter kind of existed in this little 4x6 photo album, and I just tried to just focus on each story, and I thought, maybe I'll just serialize this online, and index cards about the size of a smartphone screen. And I didn't really think of it past that. I had some vague ideas how I might lay it out, but nothing concrete at all. And as the story started to come together, and it started, this critical mass, and I started talking about the book with my publisher, Drawn and Quarterly. They're like, well, what do you think about laying this? How are we going to lay this book out? And I was like, I'm not quite sure. And Tracy, my editor, says, let me take a stab at it. And she basically presented the layout, which is how it is. And I was like, oh, that's good. I like that. And for me, it harkened back to some of Lynda Barry's books, too. Like the Ernie Pooh comics are laid out in a similar way. It worked. I mean, when we put all the stories together, there were places where I had to add a panel, so things got pushed back away, and
things would end on the right page count, et cetera.
Et cetera. But I'm happy with the way the format looks.
Mm-hmm. And that sense of the non-varying panels, almost maybe I'm ascribing too much to it, captures the grind that this guy is going through in terms of I don't want to say the monotony of marriage falling apart and what he's dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But that sense of, the highs and lows are not there for this guy. Was that your reading of it? Like I don't know if in part, that this is a guy who's going through, that in terms of, not knowing where the future is going exactly, but not having a whole lot of prospects to think are all that. Not that we want to give anything away about the book, but
Yeah, well, it certainly sets up a specific kind of rhythm. I don't know what else to say about that one.
No worries. Yeah. People are going to read it. Millions of people are going to read it. You'll see. Tell me about starting CCS. What it means to...
What would you like to know about that?
What led you to start a school for cartoonists, and do you wish it had existed when you were young?
I was definitely looking for a place like CCS when I was applying to graduate schools, and I remember writing to Lucy Caswell when... If you didn't know me from Adam, but I was like, I am a cartoonist and I want to find out a place to, kind of go further in my craft and learn comics on the graduate level. And she actually responded with like a little Xerox of different schools that had programs and whatnot. So So yeah, I guess I did wish there was a program like that when I was looking around. And I started it because, for a lot of reasons, right? Like, I wanted that type of school to exist. Mm-hmm. I needed a job, and I didn't feel I was well suited to work in a bigger art and design school. I had done some entrepreneurial projects before. I helped start a Seattle newspaper called The Stranger in Seattle in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. I taught in an art and design school for 4 years, and the people who had started it was only 20 years old, and the people who had started it, I was like, oh my God, they could do it. Like, why can't I? And, and I came from a moment, I came of age as a cartoonist where, John Porcelino's putting together comics and Adrian Tomina's putting together his Optic Nerve, and I admired the underground cartoonists for, their vim and vigor and seizing the means of production. So that DIY was kind of, it's like, okay, well, if you want to be a cartoonist, you make a comic. You want to, you want that kind of school, you make a school. So it kind of grew out of that, I think, out of that kind of cartooning mindset that I had.
Yeah, what did those 4 years of teaching that you had done teach you about, either about, starting your own institution like this, or about things you don't want to see in CCS? What were were there any negative?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I felt like, where I was teaching, in a lot of schools, actually Ben Catcher said it really well yesterday when he introduced me to, I gave a talk at his Picture Story Symposium, but he had said about CCS that, at most schools, they try to fit comics into the curriculum. And at CCS, like comics, like that's the reason for its existence. So you have a program where, you have 3 or 4 courses, 5 courses a semester, and they're not competing against each other. So the production class, you're scanning in pages that you drew in your cartooning studio class. You have a, guest lecturer in the visiting artist class, maybe to speak to the assignment that's that week as well. So the curriculum kind of all works together in a way. So that's that's part of it. I don't know if there's a program that's specific to kind of the cartooning auteur.
One that's integrated like that, not just this is how you draw comics.
Yeah, and it's standalone. Like, so we, the students that we get are like really like they've decided this is what they want to do. You don't come to CCS and decide you're going to go into animation or, another course of study. Like that's it.
Mm-hmm. How have the students changed over the...
How have the students changed?
Let's say 12 years, 15 years?
Yeah. That's a good question.
And how's the institution changed? If you want to use those as a contrast.
The institution is always evolving. Like every, semester, we have several meetings a semester and talk about the curriculum and, curriculum that works for, one class will be challenged by another class. So, it's like you're coaching a team. You could have a system in place, but if you don't have the players to,
it's one of the things I appreciate about Offseason is the little sports asides that are in it. Like when I'm watching TV, it's legit. It's not like Dan Clowes just like quoting some absolutely absurd thing. You actually have like real sports speak in the background.
I do like sports. Yeah. It's
I figure it's another Porcelino connection with you.
I'm actually going to a Knick game tonight, which I'm excited by. Yeah.
So, except it's the Knicks, so it's.
I know, but I was thinking like there's something about I'm reading an Amos Oz. No, he passed recently, and I haven't used this as an opportunity to familiarize myself with Amos Oz. And he was just talking about this book Judas, and he was talking about how just the idea of something, in striving for it is much more satisfying than actually achieving it, right? And and I feel like with the Knicks, like they're really bad. But I kind of enjoy it. Like they're rock bottom right now.
Yeah, they're striving for the number 1 draft pick so they can get Zion Williamson. I'll say the last Knick game I went to, I met Clyde Frazier because I was there like an hour and a half early. I was there with a pal, and we saw Clyde just sitting. Went over and took a picture with him. This is like pre-iPhone era, but that was I really don't need to come to the Garden again. I've just met Clyde, and that's pretty much the end.
Yeah, no, I don't really follow. I only really kind of follow the NBA, and I'll listen to baseball during during the season, but I'll never sit down and watch a game. It's just, kitchen's really clean during baseball season. I'll put on a game and do the dishes till the whole kitchen's clean if it's a good one.
That's what the baseball is there for, is just to have as, audio wallpaper. Or,
hear stories. Yeah.
I cheered when Mariano got into the Hall of Fame with a unanimous vote. But that's,
I saw that on the post when I was
again, we grew up in the same general area. So, I was a Yankee and Knick guy. And now, time.
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Yeah.
But again, back to how the CCS has changed and how students have changed over the years.
We have just such a range of students that it's hard to pigeonhole them.
The general trends in terms of maybe the
more
influences?
women for sure.
Okay.
Absolutely. When I taught at SCAD in the late 90s, you had 20 students in a sequential art class. And, maybe there's 3 women, 2 women. Our freshman class at CCS, I think it's like 14 out of 17 are women right now.
Nice.
So that's a good thing. It's good that
I always tell people it's the single worst thing I do about this show is balance male and female guest counts. It's always, and last year was the worst single year I've ever had in terms of overloading male guests and few female ones. So I'm really trying hard to do that, but you sort of have to do that consciously.
I think, good educators just, really go all out to kind of meet their students where they're at, more than halfway, and got some great faculty at the school. And it's a small school. There's not a lot of bureaucracy. So if you want to, the culture changes, every year to a certain extent based on the students there. Because, the student body is much higher than the administrative body. So they really set the tone. And, we have these remarkable fellows that come, and that also kind of, depending on who the fellow is, Karen Katz is the fellow now. She's really remarkable. Vance Guyver was the fellow a couple of years ago, and he's also remarkable, but just very different personalities. And, that, of course, changes, the flavor of the school. And as I said earlier, like there's no, I'm not tied to one way of doing it either. Just like the comic, there's not like one right way to do it.
What surprised you about CCS based on your expectations building it? What do you look back at? I did not think it was going to become this, or I did not think this was going to be the shape it took, or the way something would.
Yeah. Well, I really believe that there is a place for a school like this.
I just mean in terms of, like, when I quit my job and launched a trade association, I did not ever think I was going to have to register as a lobbyist with the federal government.
Yeah.
Weird things that you're like, wow, I did not think that launching CCS would mean that you had to become a lobbyist. I'm just kidding. But how did it change from your expectations into the reality, I guess?
Yeah, I'm going to have to pass on that one. I'm not sure I had so many expectations, I think the thing that I'm constantly reminded of is when you're working with students and people who are kind of coming of age, if not as human beings, at least, as cartoonists, there's an ebb and flow of every semester that you just kind of get pulled into.
Yeah.
You can't be outside of that. And, that's a really intense process because you're going places with people as they bring up different things in their work. And as a result, you deal really intimately with people, and I don't know, I didn't think like I'd make these like lifelong friends.
Yeah. That's sort of what I'm wondering.
Like so many of my former students, I just consider really dear friends now, and peers and colleagues, and just we've been around long enough to see them kind of flourish.
Yeah, do you remember the first time one of your students produced a work outside of CCS that you thought, holy crap, like this person, D&Q or Fanta or whatever? Not in any sense of proprietary, they couldn't have done that without me, but just a,
I remember, Joe Lambert was a member of our second class, and boy, astounding, remarkable skills, like And then you watch people just like develop before your eyes, get better and better. I mean, that whole second class was pretty remarkable, from JP and Sean and Alex and et cetera, et cetera. Chuck Forsman. I mean, they were really, really remarkable group. So yeah, I'm always, it's like you have like this front row seat of like the origin story of these amazing cartoonists, you know? So I feel really lucky to be able to sit in on that, for sure. Yeah.
And who let you down the most? I'm just kidding. I just want to be.
It's always myself. The answer to that question is always myself.
Yeah, and I was a crippling neurotic. I'm with you. But to get back to your work, not just off season, but with the other, again, quote unquote, grown up comics. There's a certain sense of an exploration of America. I mean, there's a collection of 3 of your shorter graphic novels called James Sturm's America. But even Market Day, which takes place in Eastern Europe, is nonetheless, which is set in the sort of fictionalized Eastern Europe, nonetheless shows a certain American approach to art and commerce in terms of what the subject matter really is. Is that that sense of trying to divine some sort of understanding of America integral to your comics making, or is it just something that I'm kind of overlaying on it?
Well, I'm sure as somebody born and bred in America, and as an American, I'm sure that sensibility just informs my work.
Yeah, but for a lot of artists, it doesn't.
Right.
There's a degree that sense of Americanness about your.
Even if, like, how can it not though? Like, in some way, shape, or form, if you were born, bred, and grew up in America, like that, wouldn't it inform it on some level, whether consciously or not?
Yeah.
I would think it does. I don't know.
And to what extent is that, a deliberate, or at least something?
Well, much more deliberately in a book called James Sturm's America.
Sure,
whereas a book like Market Day, that I wasn't really getting at. I don't think I was getting at, when I think about the themes of that book, it's more of that crossroads of when one has to feel they have to choose between a career and a calling, and I think that's not, I think that's a dilemma that not just Americans have to face. I think that artists of all generations and writers have to kind of sometimes wrestle with that. How do I honor the work that I feel really compelled to do on almost a spiritual level, and then how do I meet my obligations and put food in my children's mouths and all that kind of stuff.
Do you feel you've done that?
Have I put food in my mouth? In my kids' mouth
too. Do you feel you're balancing career and calling?
Yeah. I mean, it's really difficult, and there are periods in your life where you're doing it more successfully than others. I talked about earlier about that idea of just paying attention. I feel like the times where I've gotten off track and with my work, the way that I come back to it is just start really focusing on what I'm doing at that moment. And there are periods in your life where things go sideways on you for various reasons. And, I know for myself, if I'm not working, there's a period of time where I just start, feeling really shitty about myself. And I've got to get back to it. And how do you get back to it? I guess this is almost like a theme to the book itself of obviously, like, how do you get back to that thing? And it gets harder and harder the further you're away. And one of the ways is just kind of like just grounding yourself in like, where am I right now? I remember when I was starting the cartoon school, the year before, I was suddenly in meetings and trying to raise money and build websites and, working with my co-founder, Michelle, and it was just taking over my life, but I wasn't making my own comics. And that's like if I'm not doing that, I'm really no good to anybody. So, my way of getting back to that is I just had a dedicated sketchbook where I'm drawing all the financial advisors. I have a nice drawing of Peter Laird's financial advisor in my sketchbook, or the people I was talking to, these, when I was putting together a board of directors for the school, and just drawing portraits of these people and little sketches. And suddenly, that never became a comic, but I remember doing that every night and just feeling how satisfying it was to make those drawings. And actually, that actually led to Market Day, because, thinking about that, how do I make a living? Why did I start CCS? A lot of it was, I definitely had a vision for the school and how I wanted to go, but also I had to figure out how to make a living. And I didn't enjoy, working at the big art and design schools. And, what was I going to do? And here was an opportunity to kind of, create something for myself where I could have a day job that I really enjoyed and loved and, could live with myself with the work I was doing.
Yeah, do you have a regular work routine? In addition to the, again, when you mentioned when you're in late stage of a book, you're really going to focus on that.
I don't really. I know like my morning real estate is the most valuable for me creatively. So I do try to get up early if I can, maybe like a 15-minute meditation. I'm looser and more playful in my work earlier in the day. And then I try to do, more of the mundane tasks later in the day. Mm-hmm. But I don't really have a set routine. There's so many, there's the cycles of the semester and, cycles of, my children's schedules. Less so now that they're older.
Plus seasonal affective disorder, living in Vermont during winter. That's that actually lends itself to cartooning. That long winter we call cartooning season. And, you stay inside and you draw and, it helps. I thought it was stay inside and slowly lose your mind, but okay, that's
those aren't mutually exclusive, though.
Did you ever risk comic burnout from, again, both making the work and just being around the school?
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny, when I was kind of losing my way when I was starting the school, I had taught in an art and design school for 4 years, and then kind of like processing my experiences of that and thinking about my own coming of age as a student. I actually did like a 400-page graphic novel about tracking the lives of art and design students through their freshman year. And I did several drafts of it. And it was getting harder and harder to keep it going because, it was basically, in startup mode starting the school, very young children, and then, finding the time to work on this comic about these students. And as the school actually started, taking off, I was, my day job was all about students and art school. And then at night I was going to draw a comic about students. It was like too much. And that's that's also another reason I pivoted towards Market Day. I wanted to kind of go to another place in my creative time, like, move to another century, basically. And kind of recalibrate what I was trying to do instead of this big, 2-volume graphic novel thing. It was just like, it's almost like a picture book, the Market Day book. Yeah.
Do you have that sort of, let's say, dream project or aspiration for the magnum opus of Sturm?
No.
Good. I figured not, but I thought you still had the someday my 700-page book will. Yeah.
No, but I shouldn't be so dismissive of that question because I certainly, like every project I do, I think about the characters and I live with them, and they're all nonfiction to me while I'm making them. You're living the emotions. It's a strange thing you put yourself through, and I think about what they're going to do next, and I have sometimes delusions of these other projects, and sometimes I walk down that road, and then eventually it's like, well, no, I'm holding on to something that I should be letting go of. Mm-hmm. And when you allow yourself to let go, it's like, it's amazing when I throw big projects overboard, and I have several grand failures. It's always so liberating, when you're like, okay, I'm going to stop throwing good money after bad, and then suddenly, like, it's those are the most fertile periods. After you've let go of something like that, and you change the way you've been doing something previously, and you start doing something new, it's very exciting.
Have you dipped back into some of those older works to mine certain things out? You mentioned Offseason beginning years earlier.
Well, sure. I mean,
not recycling drawings or anything, but are there?
No, but like there's little things. Like I
Yeah.
mentioned that I had like these little note cards, but I remember when I first met Rachel. In Seattle, and my wife's an artist, just printmaking, and she was doing some little more painting back then. But I was like, you got to get into comics, my evangelical nature about comics. And I wrote a little comic for her to draw, like I sketched out, and it was about a bunch of it was a theater group doing a feminist version of Animal Farm.
Good.
And this is in 1997 or 8. And I mean, she never, she's gone her own way and continues to make wonderful work. But I've always liked that idea and this little story I made. It's like, okay, I can embed. I'm constantly embedding things or going through old sketchbooks and. Absolutely. Like, I don't feel like I don't like the idea of like, oh, I'm going to save this idea for something else. Like, if it's a good idea and it can work, within naturally within this other thing you're doing, like just put it in. Don't save it because tomorrow's anybody's day.
Tell me about your comics upbringing. Now, you and I shopped in one of the same places.
M&M Comics?
M&M in Nyack.
Yeah.
But also the flea market on Route 59 in Nanuet. We used to, we're probably both buying X-Men comics around the same time.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, post John Byrne, the Cockrum into Paul Smith into
right around then. Yeah.
Romita Jr. or Romita, I guess, however it's pronounced.
Yeah, I think around 1980.
That's my question. How did you get out of
I went to college and I wanted to get I don't know, like.
Trust me, it was I tell the story. My freshman year at Tulane, the one semester I was there. Yeah. Texas drummer dude on my floor. Oh, man, you like comics? You got to read Love and Rockets, man. Yeah. And he handed me my first issue of the Bros, and that blew my mind, and that's where it all changed for me. You would have been a couple of years earlier, but...
Yeah, well, I was collecting, I went to the comic store every week up until I went to college, and I was following the X-Men and the Avengers and whatnot. And then, I went to University of Wisconsin, and... my frame of reference to start opening up much, and the comics that I was reading weren't keeping up. So I just became, naturally less interested in them. It wasn't, and there was a period where,
that doesn't always happen, though. I mean, we see 40-year-old men who are still, compulsively going to the comic store for a superhero fix,
This is true.
Yeah.
And also, the other thing I wanted to be a cartoonist and then it just meant what does that mean? It means you're drawing for Marvel DC, you're drawing maybe a comic strip. And, my dream was to maybe draw, do a Fantastic Four comic or something. And, but then as I got to college and I'm in drawing classes, I remember one of my first life drawing classes, I'm drawing and everyone looks a little more like a superhero. Like I'm not looking, I'm just drawing these bad superhero comics. I remember some harsh but really good crits, and forcing myself to try to draw that way. Like I didn't have that specific type of facility to draw that specific type of way, and so that door seemed like that was going to be closed to me anyway. And then what happened? And then I was. I remember like it was yesterday. I was at the university bookstore at University of Wisconsin, and there was a remainder table. And on that table was a copy of Mark Allen Samity's McDoodle Street.
Who I'll be recording with in a couple of weeks.
And that book changed my life. And
it's getting reissued by New York Review Comics, which you may have had something to do with.
Yeah, and Mark knows about my love for that book. And I just had never seen anything quite like it. It was obviously, he was doing a very stream of consciousness, but it was this long story arc. And there was just something so wild and energetic about the drawing. And it just gave me permission to draw differently and approach my work differently, and break things down differently. So that was just super, super exciting. And then that happened. And then soon after that, my sophomore year, I lived off campus. And there was somebody who moved in right underneath our apartment. And he came up just to make sure, before he rented it, to tell us that, he's a serious scientist, he's a geneticist, and to be quiet, because he's going to go to bed early. And then he, of course, was in our apartment all the time, playing poker and Risk and Monopoly. He was 13 years older than us, doing his, postdoc in genetics. And in the 60s, he collected underground comics. So when he knew about my interest in comics, he had these boxes.
You're a kid, read these.
And that was all the good. He had everything in those boxes. And it was funny too, because this guy Victor, his great uncle was Mac Rayboy. Just so happens. the great, Captain Marvel artist, amongst other things. So very strange how that went. For my wedding gift, Victor sent me those boxes of Underground comics.
Nice.
And then he wanted them back when he retired. And I sent them back. Oh. And I'm actually going to be in Portland on another part of this tour, and I'm going to go visit them. I miss them. But that box was just, it was the first time I had ever looked at Justin Green and Spiegelman and Crumb. And I didn't know who these, and just to kind of take all that in and see all the different ways people were making work.
This would be mid to late 80s you got exposed to this stuff?
I think, early mid 80s, 85, I want to say. Yeah. Pre-internet, of course.
Yeah, that's the thing again.
How else was I going to come across this? There was one book on a history of underground comics that Mark Estrin, I'm maybe not remembering that right, did. And it was this survey book of underground comics. And, obviously Crumb was a huge deal, but I grew up in the suburbs of Rockland County, and I didn't, and maybe I wasn't looking for it, but I didn't know any of that stuff existed.
Same here. Yeah. Again, I'm a little bit younger than you, but it was just, there were no head shops. There was nothing, in suburban New Jersey about 20 minutes from where you lived.
And then around that time, I came across Raw Magazine, and I saw Mouse being serialized in that. In '86, the first part of Mouse came out, and of course that, just blew a lot of minds. And, really that whole generation just, that was a game changer for a whole generation of cartoonists that kind of grew up.
Now, let me ask, because I had Peter Cooper on a couple of weeks ago where we talked about teaching also.
Yeah.
Teaching quote unquote problematic cartoonists like Crumb, is that an issue as far as developing curricula go for your students in terms of the present moment we're in and some of the very influential cartoonists of our past who may not be.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, everything's kind of up for grabs, and people are reevaluating, the history of comics and what it means to be a cartoonist and where people should belong on the canon. And I think that's the job of these young cartoonists, to be doing that and asking those questions. And I feel it's my job as an educator to take that seriously, and then also to provide context about why Crumb was such a huge influence on me, and there wouldn't be a CCS maybe without Crumb. But on the other hand, there's some very interesting things that people you can have a really interesting discussion about Crumb.
That's just wondering how much that plays into, again, being an administrator of a school where, again, we have this amazing art from our past, but it's, in the current light, it's something that's very difficult to kind of explain / justify to.
Well, but I think if you should be able to, right? About why Crumb's important and about why he was such a big influence. I think that's an important thing to note, even if I'm not trying to, I wouldn't try to convince someone to appreciate or like an artist they don't like. There are great writers that I'll always be tone deaf to, just for whatever reason. Or maybe some artists that I can appreciate, but find horrendous in terms of, their politics, but maybe appreciate something about them. I don't know, like Leni Riefenstahl or something like that. I'm not comparing Crumb to her, but you know what I mean. So, there's no easy answer there, but I think that it's a really great discussion. And I really like thinking about comics and I think we should be reevaluating its history. One of the things that we're doing at CCS in a couple weeks is we're going to the Hood Museum of Art, and they have a whole collection of Indian ledger drawings, which are, the first American graphic novels that were done in the 1860s in these ledger books. They're picture writing. They tell stories. They were done sequentially. They mark every box of what a graphic novel is. Yeah. But those aren't included in what we think about, the history books of cartooning. And they should be, right? So, the history of comics just isn't the history of the industry of comics. It's broader than that. And I think the people kind of making them now are going to kind of, help, reevaluate and change that history a little bit.
Did you get Kirby when you were young?
No.
Same here. Okay.
Yeah.
Just making sure.
Yeah.
The era that we grew up in, Kirby was not.
Yeah, but
Not in fashion, and his work at that time wasn't.
There was an undeniable power to him.
Yeah.
I remember there was this oversized, those oversized Treasury editions.
Yeah.
I had one of those. I think it was a Fantastic Four, and it was like a story of, I think they reprinted the first Silver Surfer Galactus trilogy thing, and I mean, I read those, and I remember like having the feeling of like when you're like 7 years old and you just watch The Wizard of Oz. Like you've gone through this emotional journey.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like that reading Kirby. Like there was like one story where the Avengers were in there and the Fantastic Four and the Hulk and the Thing are fighting. And it's like there was like a undeniable emotional power, but there was something that just felt so coarse when I was 12 or 9 or 10,
Yeah.
but like something so inelegant about it.
Because we were in that post Neil Adams, John Byrne era where things had that slick realism.
Right. And at that age, I really liked American cheese better than any other cheese.
Yeah.
And then, as the years have gone by, my appreciation and adoration of Kirby just continues to deepen.
What have you learned about writing female characters, writing women?
What have I learned about it, and in what sense?
Do you feel a lot of the characters in your fiction are male?
The protagonist of the revival is a female.
True.
And I did a whole book series, Adventures in Cartooning, where the protagonist is a female.
And what do you learn about writing outside of your gender voice? Is that something you felt conscious of?
It's funny, like in Offseason, I actually had a couple chapters from the wife's point of view, and it wasn't that I felt I couldn't write that, but it just didn't work with the whole piece, and I tried to show her point of view in other ways. Like I hope that she comes across as a fully realized character, a very complicated character, not a victim, not just an object of desire, but a real person with as much agency and power as the protagonist, if not more so. And I hope that comes through in the book.
It does, and that's what I'm wondering, achieving that and being able to write that without having to being able to go into her head.
I don't know if I approach writing, you want to write characters that seem real and true, and I grew up as, I have two sisters. I have two siblings. They're both sisters. I was the middle child in a household that was very much... the emotional thermostat was set by my mother of the household. Very, very strong personality. My co-founder of the school, Michelle, I'm surrounded by amazing, strong women. So it wouldn't occur to me to, I don't know. I feel like I have they surround me, and I feel like I remember my older sister went to University of Massachusetts, and I was a dumbass kid reading superhero comics in the suburbs, and she was a women's studies major, and she would come home her freshman year, and I referred to I used the word girl instead of woman, and she shut that down so fast. And it was good, it was good. And I've, so in terms of writing, I try to, in some ways every character you write is a composite of people that you know and come across, and maybe a side to yourself that gets mixed up in there. So I'm really not answering your question very well, but I'm not sure.
But yeah, I'd wondered about the ability to convey her without going into her head, and knowing that everything is being filtered through this aggrieved male narrator.
Right, who's not maybe the most reliable narrator all the time. I mean, obviously, there's this element of toxicity to his anger that's affecting his life in a very negative way, and I'm not trying to make him anything of a hero, for sure. But I am trying to show him as somebody who really wants to get to the other side of that, somebody who really wants to close that gap and return to this person who who he has a profound connection with. And that's really difficult, It's really difficult.
Yeah, and again, we won't go into the rough times you were acknowledging in the acknowledgement.
Yeah. Oh, and I mean, listen, I'm very happily married.
Yes. That was the thing, because I got to the very end of the acknowledgements and it mentioned, a thank you to Rachel. I'm like, oh, thank God. Okay, that's not what he was referring to.
Well, it's really funny as these stories were being serialized online. I got some emails from friends from, my college days.
Are you okay?
Yeah. Like, is everything okay with Rachel? I heard you guys are separating. I was a guest at some event, and I read one of these stories, kind of work in progress. And I had a guy walk up to me, and I played basketball like the day after my wedding, and I broke my finger, and I couldn't get my wedding ring off. and since that day, like I'm not a jewelry guy, so I just don't wear a wedding ring. And this guy came up after the talk, and he just said, "Hey, how long has it been?" And I said, yeah. And he's like, since the divorce, you don't have a wedding ring. And I just, you read that story. And I said, oh, no, I'm
things are fiction, right?
Yeah, it's fiction. It's fiction. But on the other hand, it's very flattering.
Was that convincing?
Well, yeah, I'm glad that people do think it feels real, like, and the one aspect of the piece, actually, that's in some ways the most autobiographical is I was renovating a house, and we had a contractor that was later, the district attorney actually filed charges of fraud against him, and I was the victim of that fraud, or my family, and it was really difficult to hold this person to account, and there was a lot of anger, and he stole a lot of money, and it was one of these horrible contractor stories, and so that aspect is
taken from life.
But when all that is happening and you get that angry and you feel you've been betrayed and you feel someone has taken your trust and use that as to con you, you start not trusting people, and you get anger and you blame. And I saw the way that it was affecting my relationship, the most important relationship in my life. My children and my wife. And when that started to feel compromised by this, it's like, holy shit. And then, of course, like, we're also at an age, and I'm sure this is the same for you. I mean, you see how many couples have dropped by the wayside. I mean, I have so many close friends that have been divorced, and some amicably, but a lot of them really messy.
But nothing's amicable. Yeah, I mean, I know they stay in touch.
Yeah, it's all relative.
But
some are horror stories.
Yeah,
some are just holy shit. Like, why is this asshole doing this?
And you realize those patterns, the things we saw with our parents' generation, we go through those also. We see, like you said, the friends who are...
Yeah.
And I know she's 20 years younger than me, fitness model, but she has an old soul. The way the guy ends up, doing the same thing the shitty guys did back in the 80s.
Yeah. So there was a lot of just, when you say, like, what's going on right now, I'm at a period where a lot of my friends are getting... are separating, or in the middle of horrible separations. And
plus you have lots of friends in the arts, so that makes it even worse.
Yeah. and then of course, like, as the political season, placing it in the middle of that political season just made so much sense, because here's this country being torn apart, and now we're at this place where we're desperately trying to figure out, how do you bridge that divide? So this relationship somehow resonates with these larger political currents that are going on in the country. So somehow it all seemed to start fitting in a way that wasn't my intention going into the piece. But once it started happening, I'd be foolish to ignore that and leave that, outside the book.
Are you ever going to get back to the project you were actually going to be working on at the Artist Colony? I think that's dead in the water. I think I'm not going to be returning to that. Yeah. Okay. Idea for next book?
Yes.
Okay. I won't ask you anything else about it.
Yeah, no, I'm right now I'm editing a bunch of stuff, and I have a couple other slowly.
No, outside of two of my last four guests, both of whom wanted to go in depth into what they're working on next, I tend to avoid that question with everybody.
It's not. Yeah.
James, I'll let you go, but thanks so much for coming on the show.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Gil.
I know that sounds like the end. But when we did the bonus segment about what James has been reading for the Fear of a Square Planet episode, he unloaded a pretty awesome anecdote. So here goes. It all harkens back 25 years to when Why I Hate Saturn came out by Kyle Baker.
Yeah.
Because it got mentioned in everybody's reading list in the Comics Journal that season. And you couldn't find a copy anywhere because, God forbid, they did a second printing of a bookstore trade paperback because there were no bookstores that would carry them back then. So it was a matter of hunting high and low to find, one copy of this beat up in a store. In Nanuet, as a matter of fact. It was the paperback exchange behind Nanuet Mall is where I dug it up.
Oh, I remember that place too. I would comb there.
Yeah, I used to have a pulp file there.
Yeah, I used to work at the Nanuet Mall. When I was 15.
Aladdin's Castle and the video arcade?
No. I would, that's where I would hide out. I was walking around with a broomstick. And I'd change the garbages and I'd walk around the mall, and I was 15, and I would, I was, if I wanted money to feed my comics habit, I had to work. So weekends and one afternoon a week, I'd take the Rockland County little transit bus, money buses, they called them or something. And I'd go to the mall and I'd walk around and cleaning. And this is this is a crazy story. Is once I was there, I was picking up my paycheck, and I walked inside and I hear shots. I thought it was, and I thought it was like something backfiring. And then several people ran out of the mall, and then I followed them, and I see a Brinks truck, and its windshield is shattered but not broken.
Yeah.
There's someone locked in the Brinks truck, bleeding out, kind of hysterical. People are banging on the things. Open it up. And he's like, I will not open it up unless there's a Brinks official. There's another driver who's bleeding out on the sidewalk, and some of the guys that work in the mall knew me because I worked there, and they're like, go get us some hot towels, and I ran into the barber shop, and they gave me one little towel. I was like, no, you don't understand. I ran into the Red Lion. Do you remember the Red Lion? I ran to the Red Lion, and they brought out these tablecloths. So what had happened was the Brinks truck was robbed by Kathy Bodine, the underground weather.
Oh, yeah, the Weather Underground.
Yeah, the Weather Underground. And they tried to go over the Tappan Zee Bridge, and they killed a couple Nyack cops. Mm-hmm. And again, I was really into Wolverine. I didn't know anything about the 60s and the underground weather, man. And boy, that was a moment where it's like, what the hell is happening? And then, because I was there, obviously I was like, what, I was interested. And it left quite a mark. And, a lot of, I actually had a story that I worked on about.
Well, I gotta say, this sounds like another comic.
It is, and that's another conversation. But I know that's from my Nanuet Mall days. But I used to hide when I was supposed to be working. I'd go to the mall. I'd go into the arcade, and there was one of the pizza places. There was one downstairs, but the better one was upstairs.
I don't remember.
And I used to take out. I didn't take out the individual store garbages, but I had side deals with people, and for pizza, I'd grab theirs when I did the carts. And,
always a hustle, Sturm. Always a hustle.
Well, you don't have a lot of money, and you're taking out the garbage anyway. But they taught me how to flip the pizzas. Anyway, talking your off, but I do remember the paperback exchange.
Yes, and that's where I had to hunt down my Kyle Baker fix back in 1980.
Yeah.
Or thereabouts, but. And that was James Sturm. His new book is Offseason from Drawn and Quarterly. James doesn't seem to have his own website, and his only social media presence is an Instagram account, James_Sturmish. That's JAMES_STURMISH. And you can find the Center for Cartoon Studies at cartoonstudies.org. It's also on Facebook, whatever that is, and also on Twitter and Instagram as Cartoon Studies, all one word. You can visit Drawn and Quarterly's site, which is drawnandquarterly.com, all spelled out, to check out Offseason and a lot of James's other full-length books, which are very worthwhile. We should have mentioned them in the bio, but anyway, James's earlier stuff is fantastic, very America-oriented, as we talked about with most of it, except for Market Day, which is more about art and commerce. Anyway, James Sturm, great cartoonist. You should get that idea already from the conversation. And after we wrapped, I asked James, so, who you been reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, and get some extra conversation, including that great anecdote we just shared, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The fourth quarter 2018 episode features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Eddie Campbell, Nora Krug, Jason Lutz, who's an instructor at Center for Cartoon Studies, Summer Pierre, David Small, Mark Derry, Michael Gerber, Angela Himsell, Kathy B. Graham, Shahar Pinsker, and Bill Cardelopoulos. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, a patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, which I think I just had a breakthrough for this weekend. I'm going to need to sit down and do some writing for, but I think I've figured out something that will make it complete. Not that you need to know, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. I recorded this episode at a pal's apartment in New York City, so there's a usual George Washington Bridge toll of $12, $30 or so for parking on 96th Street, another $6 for the subway. This is the same afternoon evening I recorded with Mort Gerberg, so the costs are amortized across a pair of podcasts, and I also got to hang out with Tom tomorrow for dinner after finishing with Mort, but we didn't record with that. Still, it all kind of piles into the same evening. So if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Now, special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Craig P. Steffen, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You can check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Martin Haglund, author of the new book, This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, tell people on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It'll help us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.